Well, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm really delighted to have so many people joining us today for this webinar, which looks at Germany's plans for missile defense, how they relate to the European security situation, and the broader international challenges faced by the transatlantic community. I'm really honored that we've got a great cast of panelists here with us today, including Dr. Jeffrey Lewis from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, with Lydia Wachs of Stockholm University, and who most recently was at the SWP research organization in Germany, where she wrote an analysis of Germany's missile defense plans, and Dr. Frank Sauer from the Bundeswehr University in Munich. So if I can just take 60 seconds to set the stage, many people out there will be aware that Germany has made great efforts over the last 18 months to recapitalize the Bundeswehr, including the establishment of a special off-budget defense fund of 100 billion euros. This was launched by Chancellor Scholz just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in combination with rising German defense budgets and this new off-budget defense fund, there has been massive investment in the capabilities of the Bundeswehr, which is now coming online. One aspect that is playing an important role is missile defense, air and missile defense, where Germany has started to pour huge amounts of money into this initiative, and we will talk with Lydia at the start about the dimensions and the purpose, and then get into some of the more analytical questions that arise about how Germany's plans fit into the international context. So with that, let me turn to Lydia Wachs. Lydia, can you give our viewers an overview of how Germany is approaching missile defense, and then we'll get into some of the details.
Yes, hello. Thanks very much, Jeff, for the introduction. Yeah, I thought I'd focus on kind of three questions in my brief input to kind of get to your questions. So basically, first, what has been Germany's approach to air and missile defense so far, and why did it launch this European Sky Shield initiative exactly now? And second, what is the European Sky Shield initiative actually about? I think there's a lot of confusion still around it. And then third, how does the initiative fit into NATO's air and missile defense framework and policy? So maybe starting with the first question, what has been Germany's approach to air and missile defense so far? Why did it launch this initiative now? Well, since pretty much the Cold War, air and missile defense played really not a big role on the agenda of European capitals, including Berlin. To some extent, this changed the threat perception generally changed in Europe with Russia's annexation of Crimea and its violation of the INF Treaty, which led subsequently to military adjustments, but it did not really change the situation with regard to ground-based air and missile defense. Instead, actually, joint programs to develop new systems were terminated, probably due to a lack of political will. So when we look at Germany's ground-based air and missile defense capabilities today, it's pretty clear that, well, there's not much really. These are partly outdated and too few systems to really allow for a credible damage limitation option. Now, Germany's approach certainly changed with Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine and its massive use of missiles against Ukraine. And this actually triggered a debate in Berlin about its air and missile defense capabilities and whether, for example, there was even a capability capabilities to defend even just Berlin in case there was a war. So against this
and Lydia, what was the answer to that question, whether there was a capability to defend Berlin?
Well, not much.
Okay.
There's really not much. So against kind of this heightened threat perception on the one hand, but also with a financial window of opportunity due to the Bundeswehr Special Fund, which you just raised in the introduction, the German government launched this new initiative, the ESSI, or in German, ESSI, in the autumn of 2022 to strengthen Europe's air and missile defense. And this brings me to the second question. What is this initiative actually about? As I already said, when Berlin announced the initiative, I think there was a lot of confusion around it, and I think there is still really a lot of confusion due to a lack of better communication on Berlin's part. Now, to be clear, ESSI is neither a single system nor some kind of an all-encompassing protective shield, which some people would like it to be. It is simply a procurement initiative focused on ground-based air and missile defense. So the goal is to really procure more air and missile defense systems as quickly as possible and to incorporate them into NATO's integrated air and missile defense, short IAMD, and to achieve both economic scale effects, so basically to buy cheaper, and to create military synergies. Germany has invited its European partners to jointly procure various off-the-shelf air defense systems. And so far, about 18 countries have joined Berlin's initiative, and several others have expressed their interest. So in this framework of the initiative, the German government has identified systems for 4 different interception layers that it wants to procure with financing from the Bundeswehr Special Fund. And I'll quickly go through this list of systems. So for the very short range, the Bundeswehr will acquire the close air defense system, which is supposed to protect basically land operations from attacks by, for example, helicopters and unmanned systems. For then the next layer, the short to medium range, the Bundeswehr will procure the IRIS-T SLM, which can be used to defend not only against UAS, but also helicopters, aircraft, and even cruise missiles. And we have seen it being used by Ukraine in the past months. Then for the long ranges, the Bundeswehr already uses the US Patriot systems, which you will probably all know, but is planning on buying more ammunition or more missiles and replenishing existing stocks. Now, these 3 systems for the short, medium, and long range are being offered to partners to procure within this ESSI initiative. And a couple of countries have already made their procurement plans public. But in addition to procuring these systems, or these 3 systems within the initiative, Berlin has also identified a capability, or a further capability gap, basically, regarding very long ranges. And for this reason, it plans to develop a capability to defend against long-range precision weapons. Initially, this is happening only at the national level, but later it will perhaps examine whether and how this capability can be offered to partners and basically be integrated into the NATO structure. And here Germany intends to procure the Arrow system, which was developed by Israel and the United States, but so far only Israel deploys this system to defend against Iranian missiles. And so far, Arrow 3, Arrow, the system with the Arrow 3 intercept, is supposed to defend against medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles outside of the atmosphere. Now, these plans and procurement decisions, I believe, raise several questions, and I'm sure my co-panelists will talk more about kind of the strategic dimension and reasoning behind it, which can probably be questioned. But I just want to briefly touch upon kind of the European or NATO dimension with the last question. So how does the initiative fit into Europe's air or NATO's air and missile defense framework and policy? Here, I believe there is a potential for tension or friction in 2 ways. First, Germany's plans, and especially the Arrow procurement, raise, first of all, a technical operational question. Since there is no kind of one-size-fits-all solution against all kinds of threats, a prerequisite for an effective integrated air and missile defense architecture is the interoperability of its individual components. So basically that these different components share data rapidly. For this purpose, NATO's IAMD is based on the NATO Integrated Air and Missile Defense System, the NATINAMS in short, which is in fact a network linking the alliance's various sensors, C2, so command and control assets, and weapon systems. And for the systems that are procured within ESSI for the short, medium, and long range, that should not really be a major problem. These are indeed interoperable. But with regard to Arrow, in case Germany actually wants to integrate it at some point into the NATO architecture, this could be indeed tricky. Arrow so far is not interoperable with this architecture, and there are mechanisms within NATO in place to determine the interoperability of these non-NATO systems, but this requires Israeli and US consent. And here it is quite unclear whether this would be given. At least for now, there's a difference of opinion between Brussels and Berlin on this question of a potential integration of Arrow. And then the second point of tension is rather political, and it concerns how Arrow fits into NATO's broader air and missile defense policy. So far, the alliance has basically identified two separate missions in the area of air and missile defense. On the one hand, the so-called NATO IAMD, which I already talked about, and which follows a 360-degree approach and thus includes defense also against Russian shorter-range ballistic missiles. And then there is, on the other hand, NATO Ballistic Missile Defense, NATO BMD, which is a component of NATO IAMD, but is directed only against longer-range ballistic missile threats from outside the Euro-Atlantic area, so not Russia, but rather Iran. NATO has followed this two-pronged approach in the past, mainly to appease Russia, which has, as you might know, long criticized US and NATO missile defense plans. Now, I would not argue that procuring Arrow will have a strategic effect on Russia in the sense that that Arrow could undermine Russia's second strike capability, or that this procurement will lead or will cause Russia to develop and deploy more missiles, because I believe Russia will probably do that anyways. But Arrow, with its purpose, basically, could fall somewhere between these two missions, between IAMD and BMD, and therefore kind of present a point of friction here. So one could, of course, argue that NATO's two-pronged approach might be a bit outdated anyway, but I believe a failure of Germany to coordinate this procurement of Arrow with the alliance and its missile defense strategy could complicate both NATO's policy internally within the alliance, but also vis-a-vis Russia. And I'll stop here. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Lydia. That was tremendous. Let me ask one follow-up, though. How much is Germany going to spend on air and missile defense? The 4 billion euro number has surfaced with respect to Arrow 3. I've read the figure of around 1 billion euros for the IRIS-T or IRIS-T system. But it's been hard to find a comprehensive figure. Do you know how much Germany is going to spend?
So I also only know the figures that you just mentioned. I'm not sure, maybe Frank has some more information on that, but I don't have the exact
Frank is shaking his head.
Entire,
okay. But I think one important thing, so the sort of short, medium, and long range elements of the German missile defense plans would be fully integrated into NATO's air and air defense system. And so that brings me then to Jeffrey Lewis, who is at the Monterey, the Middlebury Institute at Monterey, writes extensively on arms control and strategic issues, and devoted an episode of the Arms Control Wonk podcast to this question. And maybe that's where we'll start, if you don't mind, which is, as we've heard from Lydia, the Arrow 3 is an exo-atmospheric interceptor, and it raises the question of what it would be used against in the context of European security. So, Jeffrey Lewis, over to you.
Well, I think the question that you ask is the one that I'm constantly racking my brain over. And I do get the strong sense that a lot of the technical pieces are poorly understood by some of the people who are either involved in these debates or making decisions. And so I just, to spoil the few minutes of comments I want to make, I think the answer is no. I struggle to identify the Russian missile that this system is going to shoot down. And I just find it, to be honest, it's very curious. One thing I think is, if people are new to this issue, to start by saying, we talk about the Arrow as a system, but it's really important to understand that the Arrow 2, and the Arrow 3 are completely different missiles. I mean, they share a family name, and I think that gives the public a certain perception that, if you hear something about an older generation of Arrow, that tells you something about a newer generation of Arrow. But in fact, the Arrow 3 is an extremely unusual missile defense interceptor. At the time that the United States began allocating funding for co-development, some of the congressional testimony from officials at the U.S. Missile Defense Agency really highlighted what an unusual design it was. It was a system with a lot of technical risk. And the system seems to have turned out fine. I don't mean that I don't think the system's effective, but it's just an extremely unusual system that looks like basically no other missile defense system that exists in the world. And it looks the way it does, because it is designed for a very specific threat environment. And
more specifically, that's Iran. Sorry to interrupt.
That's Iran, and that's it's a very particular range class of missiles. I mean, this idea that we discussed about endo and exo-atmospheric, I think, is really the crucial thing for people who are coming to this from outside to understand. That how a missile defense interceptor behaves in the atmosphere is completely different than how it behaves out of the atmosphere. If you imagine that you are in a car traveling 3 kilometers per second, which is what the booster burns out at for this missile, and you open your eyes, right? The friction is going to be tremendous, and it's true of both the sensor on Arrow 3 and the general structure of the system. It's not intended to operate in the atmosphere. It will break apart, right? And so the challenge is that all of Russia's missiles, with a single exception that we can talk about, are designed of the range that are designed that Germany would worry about are endo-atmospheric. They're designed to fly relatively low in the atmosphere and be able to maneuver to some extent, right? So, Israel had a very specific problem, which is it wanted to be able to deal with very long-range Iranian missiles. But Germany is both sort of positioned close to Russia in a way, and Russia has made certain technical choices. That means there really are no Russian missiles that would be used against Germany that would be exo-atmospheric. I mean, there's this one exception, which is the Russians did develop an intermediate range ballistic missile in violation of the INF treaty, but they seem to have canceled that program.
Is that it? Do you think
that's
is that reliable? The assumption that it is canceled, is there some possibility it could come back, or
I think there's some possibility. The issue for that system is it's basically the first stage of an ICBM with a bunch of warheads packed onto it, and so the Russians could resurrect it at any time. But I think the reason Russia did that was because it was restricted from building intermediate range systems under the INF treaty and had this safe harbor of declaring this bizarre system in this particular way under New START. All those treaties are gone, right? So Russia doesn't have to play treaty games in order to acquire certain missiles. So I think, absent a lot of evidence of testing and design of this system, you're really spending the Germans are spending a lot of money to defend against a single missile type that not even the Russians, I think, at this point think is terribly desirable. And then you layer onto that this just sort of very odd situation that the United States is deploying in Poland and Romania exo-atmospheric interceptors to provide this defense to Europe. And I defer to others on this question of why that's politically undesirable. But from a strictly technical perspective, it seems odd that the RS-26, a missile that the Russians are probably not going to deploy, is getting redundant alliance and national capabilities to defend against it. So just from a kind of pure technical perspective of trying to add up, what does the system do? What are the missiles you would use it against? Do the Russians have any of those missiles? It makes very little sense, I think, in that way. And so I think that then opens us up to this broader conversation about what are the worldviews or ideological conceptions or ways about thinking about procurement that are very human, very bureaucratic, and very governmental, that push us down this route. Because if we were just playing a video game, if this were a tower defense game, you wouldn't build this tower, to shoot at these balloons.
Mm-hmm. And now, of course, as Lydia pointed out, even the Aegis Ashore sites in Europe as part of the NATO missile defense system were conceived and sort of sold politically as also focused on a threat from outside the European space. In other words, Iran as the primary driver. But do I understand you saying that in the event of, let's say, an RS-26 development and use against Europe, that the Aegis Ashore and SM-3 sites would be capable to intercept such a missile? Or is that technically not possible?
Yeah, no, the SM-3 is also an exo-atmospheric interceptor, and it's a little hard to say whether something's better or worse. I mean, it really depends on whether it fits a particular scenario. But I do notice that the German government occasionally says that Arrow 3 has some capability against ICBMs, which I'm fairly certain is untrue based on our modeling of the system. The SM-3 does actually have a limited, I mean, I still wouldn't want to be in Berlin in this scenario, but it has a limited capacity against ICBM. So yeah, I mean, I think of Arrow 3 and Aegis Ashore as being, fundamentally comparable systems. And so, it's really the belt and suspenders approach to defense seems a strange use of a couple $2 billion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And do you, your critique about the exo-atmospheric interceptor, I think, is clear. Any reflections or thoughts on the other layers of the German approach? Do those make sense from both from a technical but also from a broader perspective, in your view?
Well, there really are these two questions of how we balance the technical and the broader perspective. And I say that because in general, defense doesn't tend to be a good investment compared to other capabilities like offense. I think, what you see in the United States is we spend a lot of money on defense, but we consistently talk about how we need to move our capabilities. The phrase that often gets used in the US, which is a bit of a euphemism, is left of launch, which is a real focus on offensive missiles to suppress the missile firing in the first place.
Right.
And, I'm not naive. I understand why politically that's a hard sell, right? It's very hard to tell people, well, look, I'm sorry, we can't defend you. At least we can't defend you in the way of shooting down the missile. This is very unpopular, even in World War II, right? The British engaged in really pointless defense efforts in the homeland, but they weren't politically pointless, right? They mattered politically. They just didn't have a tremendous effect. And I know it's politically difficult to emphasize offensive missile capabilities, but I think if we treated this like it were a video game, right, and you took the human element out, which of course you can't, I think we would probably conclude that the best way to reduce the effectiveness of Russian missile attacks would be to have more offensive systems to make it, to both target the launchers and make it hard for them to do their job. But I get why politically that's extremely difficult. And so I don't think it's insane to want to spend money on short and medium range defense against endo-atmospheric threats.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to turn to Frank Sauer at this point. Maybe to ask the general question, because we've heard, from two different angles, the question raised about whether one particular element, the most expensive element of the German missile defense plan, makes any sense. What's the plausible answer if you see one, Frank?
Yeah, that's the hard question, really. First of all, thanks for having me. It's been great, to be included in this. And the first two speakers were obviously, tremendous experts on what we're talking about today. And so most of what I'm going to say is probably just going to echo, in a way, what has already been mentioned. So before I, add three more points, roughly speaking, to what Lydia was highlighting before, and also going to more closer to this notion of, this not being a purely military decision, but, a hodgepodge of different political reasoning probably going on, what Jeffrey was already alluding to. Let me quickly make two remarks in reaction to what Jeffrey was saying. Like I said in the meetings that the State Department held in Europe, in Germany in this case, when Aegis Ashore started, because, there was a lot of concern really about this system. That was, Jeffrey and I were talking, before about how old we are. And, this is 10, 13 years ago when this all started. And that was back in the good old, INF days. And we were super concerned about stability with Russia and what is this doing? And I mean, we were massaged basically by the US to accept these things on European soil. So we would have this defense against Iranian missiles. And we still have them. People probably have, forgotten about this. And now we're doubling down with Arrow on the exact same capability. Just that just makes it extra weird in a way. So the pendulum basically has swung to the other extreme in this case. So that would be one thought that I had when Jeffrey was talking. And the other thing is, so we're getting Arrow 3, and from a Russian perspective, why would you pick up a development path that you abandoned a couple of years ago only to develop a missile that Arrow 3 is already capable of defending against? I mean, Israel already went through the whole shenanigans with Iran and is now developing Arrow 4, because a lot of has happened in reaction to systems like Arrow 3, missiles with depressed trajectories and all these kinds of things that the Russians have and that the Russians can do, no problem. And so why are we acquiring this capability? It is very unclear. So that will be two thoughts in immediate reaction to Jeffrey. And basically, since I was kind of also tasked to give this broader political view, I have three brief remarks on this. And obviously, the wider framework for this is Zeitenwende, is this turning point that Jeff, you introduced us to at the very beginning. And if you think about where and how missile defense fits in this, it does begin with the stated ambition of Germany, not only turning the Bundeswehr into the continent's strongest, most formidable fighting force. Not sure the Poles got this memo, by the way, but that is the stated ambition.
Yeah,
and
although the subsequent formulations have been a little less categorical about Germany's ambition to be the leading fighting
why
force
would
in
that
Europe.
be? I wonder. And and of course, Europe, Germany playing a European leadership role, and Jeffrey already basically put it perfectly. The Sky Shield initiative is just so much more digestible to both political decision makers in Berlin as well as the wider German public, that this alternative notion that Jeffrey pointed out, just get a whole bunch of missiles and basically do like a deterrence posture towards the Russians, like a left of launch kind of thing, you would never be able to sell this to the German public. And so I remember vividly when in Sicherheitshalber podcast a couple of years ago, we had an episode on missile defense, and we went through like how does it work and when does it work and like stuff like that, like the basics. And people were totally flabbergasted because like the regular German is basically walking the streets assuming that there's a 99% secure missile shield protecting them all day every day already in place, and they were like shocked learning that this is not the case. And really from a political sell, basically we're buying something that people already expected is in place anyway. So it's really easy for Berlin to move this, politically speaking. And going above and beyond Germany, there's just implications for wider Europe. As I said, being a leading power. This Green Pine radar of Arrow 3 is very capable. So you obviously have coverage of Eastern and Central European states. Maybe there's data sharing agreements, I don't know. And also space situational awareness might be a factor that is playing into this. So that would be my one notion. Second, I can keep really brief because Lydia has already pointed all of this out. The ESSI, the Sky Shield initiative, is a procurement initiative, and lo and behold, Estonia and Latvia just, you know, signed contracts for getting a whole lot of IRIS-T SLMs. So in other words, it is, and this goes back to what Jeffrey was saying about this not being purely purely a military endeavor, but just a mix of various political drivers
and a strong defense industrial
it is exactly. Yeah, the idea is also to be selling a lot of IRIS-T within Europe, and you know, I wouldn't say there's nothing wrong with that, but that is part of Sky Shield. And third and last, I think buying Israeli is a good way for Berlin to be able to say to Paris that Germany is not buying in Washington. I mean, we all know that Arrow is not purely Israeli, but it is at least half US developed. But France is already rather miffed regarding all kinds of German reluctance in joint programs. Moss, the sub-hunting plane, was dropped. MGCS is not going great. Future Combat Air System is a bumpy ride still. And we all know that, you know, in Paris, the notion of European sovereignty, autonomy, whatever we want to call it these days, just is of greater importance. It is of greater importance to Macron than it is to Scholz. And I think it is, from a Berlin perspective, with regard to Paris, an easier sell to say we're buying this from Israel rather than buying just, for instance, I don't know, SM-3s.
Well, and Israel is not just any other country. It is a country with which Germany has identified a particular interest in Israel's security. And so a deepening of the defense relationship between Israel and Germany is it serves a very different, bilateral political purpose from the point of view of German leadership, I would imagine.
Yes. And I mean, and yeah, to sum up, you know, these procurement decisions never are based on purely, it's not a video game, you know, it's not a rock, paper, scissor arrangement. There's always political factors. There's pork barrel politics involved. And I am puzzled by the Arrow 3 decision as much as the next person. But, you know, there is also, in all fairness, a couple of things that go above and beyond this questionable notion of an actual military capability gap that also play a role in this decision, and probably, and that you know have to acknowledge as something that probably went through the heads of the decision makers when this was decided.
Right. We will come to questions from our audience. Use the Q&A function, please, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. Use the Q&A function in Zoom, which you'll find on the bar in the middle of the bottom of your screen. But before we do, I just wanted to come back to the point that Jeffrey Lewis made, and Frank, you responded to it to a certain degree. But I want to see if, Lydia, you have thoughts or other further reflections on this balance between offense and defense, and whether that is something that requires further assessment and further incorporation into the German assessment, and indeed the transatlantic and the NATO assessment of how it provides security in a changed environment. I'll leave that open for anyone to respond to. Lydia, I see you've clicked off the mute button. Go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I can really just echo what my co-panelists just said about it. So I think it is generally difficult to sell to the public if you buy basically offense. And in Germany in particular. I mean, in Germany, I think it was the start of the war. We had like this huge discussion in Germany about whether there are defensive and offensive weapons and what we can send and all of this stuff. So we had really random discussions in Germany over the past 1.5 years on military. There was also even, I mean, when the war started, I felt like there was not really a general sense of, or among the public, of what deterrence, for example, actually is. Like, we had so many media like videos and things that kind of explain really basic like deterrence strategy, deterrence by punishment, etc. So I think there was really just not an understanding of these mechanisms. And there is, I think, kind of the war has in a way allowed for a better understanding among the German public, but also the political community in Berlin on military topics and strategy topics. But I think there's still a really limited knowledge, as Frank said. Like, really, I think there was, I mean, I can just tell from kind of media requests that colleagues and I got about like shields, like whether there is a shield and whatever. So I think there is still a lot of catching up that has to be done. And in this context, and then especially for a social democratic chancellor with probably, or at least partly critical voter base, like critical in terms of military things, it's really difficult then to sell or to talk about, well, we are going to buy like precision strike long range capabilities or something like that, or we're even going to develop that. It's like really nothing that you can really sell. And I think this is like one factor. Probably the other is there's also not really, I'm not sure, like to what extent really these decisions are really being made in a strategic manner. There are so many political interests and bureaucratic processes that play into these decisions. At least that's what my experience has been, that I'm not sure whether there's like really somebody, I mean, we now have a national security strategy, which maybe helped a little bit, but still, on kind of the broader strategy of Germany, I'm not sure whether there's a really good understanding or even,
Yeah. So let me follow up on that, Lydia, because you mentioned the German national security strategy, which was released just a few months ago, and in it there is a pretty clear statement that Germany is going to develop and introduce precision deep strike weapons, which gets at Jeffrey Lewis's point about the balance of offense and defense. We haven't yet seen the details of what this is going to look like, but it seems that certainly in the strategic assessment and planning of the German government, that this is part of the equation. So either you or Frank or Jeffrey Lewis, for that matter, what do you think one should be looking out for? What should one anticipate? How might that take shape?
So, I mean, I haven't seen any more details either. So I might, hand this question to Frank or to Jeffrey if they have anything on that.
My mind immediately goes cruise missiles. You know, I mean, we're now talking Taurus. We've got 80 million Taurus experts now in Germany, because this is such a big deal. You know, do we give it to the Ukrainians? Yes or no? Do we limit it in some sort of geofencing kind of way? Why are we debating this? So France and Britain has already, they have already moved on this. But that is actually a very interesting passage, Jeff. It's super interesting that you noticed this. I don't know either if that's already manifested in one specific system that is supposed to be developed, but I'm thinking of something like Taurus.
Mm-hmm. If I could just say, from the outside, I find this really interesting because there is this kind of distinction in people's mind between missiles that are launched from the ground, which are scary and terrifying and surface all of the like Euro missiles anxiety of the late 1970s when I was a child. And those same missiles, if they are dropped off airplanes or put on ships where they are safe and wonderful. And there's almost a kind of alchemy that exists. And I say that because it does strike me, and maybe this goes to our role as, outside experts, there is a role for leadership to move public opinion as the threat environment changes. And so I think back to sometimes I like to misbehave and maybe stir the pot a little. And I was in Munich for the security conference, right after the INF treaty was collapsing. And I suggested to a former Polish official that instead of whining about, US capabilities, that Poland was quite free to build all of the intermediate range missiles it it would like, and he got very upset with me, and he wanted to know where they'd buy them, and I suggested South Korea would certainly sell them. He got even more upset with me. And I observe now that Poland is buying precisely those missiles from South Korea. And so what was such an impermissible thought that, he got very short with me at a nice meeting, where I'd even bothered to put on a tie and things, quickly became politically possible in Poland not long after. And so I don't know what the alchemy that makes Taurus okay, but if you had ground launch Taurus, it would not be. But I do think these things can change over time, if there's political leadership, to that effect.
And if there's anything that has characterized this German government in approaching changes to Germany's defense capabilities and posture, it has been extreme caution in managing public perceptions and public impressions. So perhaps there may be more to come, but if so, it may be slow and especially for the expert community, frustratingly slow. I'd like to move to some of our questions now, and I'll start with the first one. And this is I'll put two together, which are about Russia. The first one is an observation. How come there has been no reaction from Russia in response to the announced procurement of the Arrow 3 system by Germany? In other words, is that a dog that's not barking, in my words? But then there's also a question, is there a chance that the German government is anticipating that NATO will have to reorient the NATO ballistic missile defense against Russia, and therefore needs to be in a position to contribute a component that is similar to the SM-3? In other words, could this be the German government acting in a way that is perhaps proactive, uncharacteristically proactive, you might say, in terms of capability acquisition that might be useful down the road? I'll leave that open to any of the panelists to respond to.
As in Trump-proofing Europe, basically?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put it in that context, but to have a capability. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would, and I would say that is the argument is fair. It is just still a bit weird to start like exo-atmospheric, basically, rather than say, with maybe tanks or other stuff that we're also lacking when we're starting to think of, hey, how do we want to develop the European pillar within NATO, and what does European sovereignty mean, and how do we create a defense industrial base in Europe where we've got economies of scale and all these kinds of things. This is just me. I would start with those smaller things, comparably smaller, rather than just immediately going exo-atmospheric Arrow 3 missile defense, which is a super niche at best capability that we're duplicating. But hey, and that will be my answer to the question. The question is fair, but it's still weird with regard to Arrow 3. Having said all that, one maybe unpopular thing. Lydia is completely correct. I've had all these super astonishing media requests. It is correct that we're having a very exotic niche expert discourse here. However, I also think it is always worth reminding yourself to stay humble and maybe think that we don't know everything. Maybe we're just not privy to the information that we would need to better understand why all of that happened. And so I'm thinking that, and then the immediate next step in my mind is, well, why not explain it to us in a way that we can understand? And if you weigh these two things, like, why would they not tell us why Arrow 3 is happening in a way that we can understand? The only reason would be, well, Operation Security, something, the Russians not giving up our capabilities. But given the fact that there's really nothing on the Russian side, and we know this, we would know, like, if there were, that doesn't make sense to me either. So I'm just longing for the Luftwaffe to basically explain to me why I'm the idiot. And that's not really happening either.
Maybe they'll take you up on that afterwards. Jeffrey Lewis, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the Russian issue. And I think this really goes to this kind of, I often talk about the technical pieces, but the political pieces are the more important pieces. And I think in the case of Russia, it's very interesting because I think if Germany had bought SM-3 interceptors instead of Arrow 3, the Russians would have complained just as much as they did about the systems in Poland and Romania. And so my interpretation of the Russian lack of response is that they're reading the vibes, you know, as we would say in the US, which is that they're, you know, my sense is that Putin has always tried to split Germany off from the Western alliance and tried to encourage a more neutral Germany, which I think has been largely unsuccessful. But I think from their perspective, at a really simplistic level, the fact that the Germans are buying something from the Israelis, even though it's a 50% US system, I think has a completely different alliance implication to the Russians than if they had bought SM-3. And I think even if the capabilities are exactly the same, I don't think the Russians are sitting down and worrying about the capabilities per se. I think that they're much more focused on these kind of inner alliance politics. And to the extent that they see this decision as maybe being a little divisive in NATO, maybe representing, I don't really think it's that divisive, but I think it's much less threatening to them than it would be if, you know, the German government did something that was politically hard and anchored Germany deeply in the NATO alliance. That would freak the Russians out. This, I think, is, you know, not an issue for them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Jeffrey, while you've got the mic, so to speak, there are a couple of questions also directed more specifically to you. One is about the Russian missile threat and the RS-26 that you've already spoken about a bit. How likely could Russia is it that Russia could get one, to make one operational soon, and what are the timelines that one would be talking about? And then there's another question, which is about the modeling regarding ICBM defense capabilities of the Arrow 3 versus the SM-3.
Right. So, you know, the RS-26, I think Frank, you know, said it perfectly. It would be strange for the Russians to turn around and resurrect a system that is going to fly into $4 billion of defenses when they have lots of other options. But, you know, defense industries, and we've just been teasing the German government about doing things that are slightly irrational. So let's admit that all governments can do this. You know, the Rubej is really just a Yars first stage with a bunch of warheads packed on it. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, they could do that tomorrow. That's an extremely reliable booster they have access to. They've already tested it with the appropriate combat payload. That system is, I think, functionally ready to go. It's just, would they want to shift whatever Yars production they're engaged in over to an intermediate range system? From my perspective, right, if I were the Russians, which, you know, I'm not, and I'm kind of humble about that, but I think the only advantage of an intermediate range system, if you're not playing treaty games, and they don't have to do that anymore, is if you wanted to really pull things back. But I
pull things back in what way? How do you mean that?
Like not have them in European Russia, and if you wanted to fire at NATO from much deeper in Russia. But I think that's probably not, it's not what I would do. I would be focusing really heavily on things like Iskander, both the ballistic and cruise missile, and just doing them in large numbers, so that they were hard to intercept. But, you know, maybe the Russian defense industry has an unneeded requirement to churn out useless Yars boosters. So I accept that. In terms of the modeling question, you know, what we did was we measured the Arrow 3 really carefully from photographs, and we looked at its acceleration and other things, and we came up with a model, and we get a burnout speed of the booster that's a little bit lower than SM-3. And so that would generally suggest it's a little bit less capable. But there are real profound differences in these interceptors. And so the Arrow 3 has this crazy rocket motor on its kill vehicle that gives it really big divert capabilities. And that's just extremely hard to model. So my kind of impression of having modeled, missile modeling it, 8:20 in the morning in California time. Nobody needs this. But my impression is that Arrow 3 is going to be probably better. It's going to be very, very good against medium and intermediate range ballistic missile threats. It's really optimized to do well against those. I am not sure that it's really going to have the burnout even with that upper stage in order to deal with ICBMs. But you know, I guess we'll discover, right? We'll get more data and we'll learn.
Yeah. I want to come back also to the Israel Germany bilateral aspect, which we've touched on already in a couple of places. This would be Israel's, if I'm not mistaken, this would be Israel's largest ever foreign military sale. At least that's what I've found in Israeli sources. I don't know exactly what the work share is and how much that 4 billion euros, how much of that accrues in Israel versus how much accrues with the U.S. Partners. But I wonder if, especially from our German colleagues here, any comment on how important this might be from an Israeli perspective. Although, Jeffrey Lewis, you may have a view on this as well. Is there a way in which this is also a game changer in terms of the defense industrial ties and the defense commercial relationship between Israel and Germany at a time when the bilateral relationship is not, has its share of frictions, including over the judicial reforms and so forth, which the German government has criticized?
Lydia's waiting it out. I haven't spent a lot of thought on this, but I mean, 4 billion is a big number. And while you were talking, I was thinking, what else is there? And the first thing that immediately came to my mind, of course, is Heron CP, which is a leasing, scheme that we have with the Israelis to, fly those mail drones. And I don't have a number for this, but it will be like a fraction of 4 billion. And so I believe in a second that is the biggest, chunk of money that has, ever been moved, especially from Germany to Israel. But to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure. I don't know, like, how big a deal that is within Israel. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Lydia.
Yeah, maybe to add something. I mean, I've also not really thought about it from this perspective, rather from like Germany's interest in strengthening relations with Israel. And I think there's a big interest on part of Berlin and especially the Luftwaffe also. So I think we should not underestimate also this factor in the entire procurement initiative, this, pretty political interest, I would say. I would add that, I mean, as far as I know, Israel is, or Finland is right now procuring or is planning on procuring the David Sling from Israel as well. So there's another kind of sale from Israel to a European country. So I don't know if there's generally an interest on the Israeli part to kind of, strengthen those defense, those armament corporations with European countries, and whether kind of this German-Israeli deal could be setting kind of the basis for further sales. I'm not sure. Maybe that plays a role, maybe not. I can at least say that from the German perspective, there is a big interest in strengthening relations with Israel.
All right,
and I will say that it went very smooth and with lightning speed compared to any other procurement process. Like the chief of the German Luftwaffe, traveled there. The head of the Parliament's Defense Committee traveled there. You had some going back and forth of important people in this regard between Israel and Germany, and bang, there was a deal. So it just went like really fast, probably. And sometimes as we say, sometimes things just maybe even click on a personal level.
Mm-hmm.
And it is correct that German Luftwaffe, for instance, has very close ties, and we did this flying information thing with the with the Israelis, and I mean, and all of that is great. And I mean, yeah, it ended up in this, you know, put together deal in just a couple of weeks, which has, I don't know, I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah. I have one question that goes back a bit to the European dimension of this, and I'll start with Lydia, but look to others to chime in. But before I do that, I also, Frank, you made a reference to your own podcast, Sicherheitshalber, of which I am a faithful listener. So let me just say a plug to that for anybody who wants to listen in German to analysis of security and defense and international relations issues. It's a great place to go. And that is, Lydia, you talked about the decisions of about 18 European countries to sign on to the European Sky Shield initiative. And I think, Frank, you mentioned decisions made in the Baltics to acquire the IRIS-T SLM. Do you have any emerging estimate of how much this is actually going to increase European capabilities? In what sense is Germany's attempt to demonstrate European leadership showing results? And over how long should we be assessing that question?
So, I mean, if we look at the current participants in this initiative, there's quite a bit of diversity, both in terms of like to what extent, or whether they are part of NATO or not, and generally their political outlook. And so, I mean, there are certainly a couple of countries that have already made their procurement plans through ESSI public. So, for example, we just heard about, I think, Austria. I mean, Austria and Switzerland, also really interesting participants of this initiative that joined us, kind of the last participants. And Austria, for example, wants also to buy the IRIS-T, and I haven't actually really seen, like, there's been information on who's buying IRIS-T SLM. I haven't seen much about the Patriot, whether kind of this entire initiative has made Patriot more attractive to Europeans than before. I don't know. So I don't have the exact plans of kind of every member, but I mean, it does help at least smaller European countries. I mean, generally, if we look at European air and missile defense capabilities, there's not much. Germany is not the only country which has not really invested in this area. So there's, across the board, kind of a need to invest more. So this initiative, of course, gives also smaller countries with a smaller defense budget a possibility to invest in these capabilities at a also smaller price. So in this sense, it could also have like an economic incentive to countries that don't have that much to spend on it. Whether this has really changed a lot, I don't know. And also to add, I just said that there is quite a bit of diversity among those members. I mean, I have not seen any procurement plans within ESSI yet. So, for example, UK, I'm not sure, they might just have joined the initiative to kind of see what is going on in there. So I'm not sure whether this is really like the plan of all the countries to buy, but some might just be in the initiative for other reasons.
Right. Got it. Well, we are reaching time, so I just want to open the floor to any of our panelists if you have any concluding thoughts you'd like to share before I wrap things up. I see shaking of heads. So that means we've covered
one question.
Everything. Yes.
I have a question for Jeffrey, because I've been asked this 1,000 times on Twitter. People will say, but what about the Chinese ICBMs? Why maybe Arrow is, protecting us from a future Chinese ICBM threat? What am I supposed to say?
I mean, I just don't. I mean, I know the German government occasionally hints that Arrow 3 has an ICBM capability, but boy, I really feel like I can't. That's not very much burnout speed to deal with something coming all the way from China. So it's I would say it's it's just not. If you want to deal with a counter ICBM capability, you need a different interceptor.
There we go. All right. Well, let me thank our panelists, Lydia Wachs, Stockholm University, Frank Sauer, Bundeswehr University Munich, and Jeffrey Lewis from the Middlebury Institute in Monterey. And thanks to all of our listeners for being with us. So glad to have you, and thanks for the great questions. And we will look forward to having you with us again, whether it's as a listener on our own podcast, at our next webinar, or here in person in Washington. We look forward to seeing you. Thanks so much, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.